Welcome to our 81st podcast for Thanks for Your Service. Our focus is on historical topics relating to the Australian military. You can find us on Facebook, X and YouTube. Just search for Thanks for Your Service. Our website is www.thanksforyourservice.net, and you can also email us at info@thanksforyourservice.net. I recently attended a military conference in Melbourne hosted by Military History and Heritage Victoria. One of the reasons I enjoy attending these conferences is that you never stop learning about aspects of military history. In today's podcast, we learn about German U-boat activity in Australian waters during World War II, Japanese military flights over Melbourne and Hobart, and learn more about Military History and Heritage Victoria. So joining us on the line is Jason McGregor, Secretary and Treasurer of Military History and Heritage Victoria, or MHHV. Jason, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks for the invite, David.
Now, let's first start with MHHV. What is it and what do you do?
Well, Military History and Heritage Victoria, obviously an incorporated not-for-profit association in Victoria. We're dedicated to promoting and preserving Australian, particularly Victorian military history and heritage. We want to encourage interests and foster public and individual interests in all aspects of Australian and Victorian military history and heritage. We research and support activities relating to preservation. We promote the interests of our member organisations and some government bodies and communities, and the general public, while fostering cooperation with the military and history heritage community. We run a whole bunch of events as well.
You folks do a great job of hosting a number of conferences and presentations on topics relating to military history each year. And I was fortunate enough again to attend a conference you held this month, as in May 2025. What was the theme of that conference?
Menace at Home, which was the Menace at Home conference, essentially covering Australia under attack 1939 to 1945. It was a one-day conference looking at how Australia was actually threatened during World War II, not the existential threats, but the real threats, such as over 1,800 enemy air raids, submarine reconnaissance, the prisoner of war breakout in Cowra, even a serial killer lurking around that was one of our friends, but also was a threat to our nation.
You had a really great lineup of speakers, and you also gave a presentation during that conference. What was your presentation on?
Well, in 20 conferences we've put together, this is the first time I presented myself a paper. My presentation was specifically on submarine reconnaissance off coast of Australia. German and Japanese. There was a primary focus, of course, on the Japanese, because the Germans only had one submarine working in Australian waters that we know of. That was U862, which was one of 30 Type 9 D2 U-boats. People can look that up. It sailed out of Batavia from a Japanese base, travelling along Western Australia's coast, across the Great Australian Bight, through Bass Strait and into the Tasman Sea. Did a bit of activity, sank a few ships, most notable the Robert J. Walker off Gavo Island. And there's an unverified post-war claim about U862 that by one of the crew members. He claims that they briefly went ashore in South Australia's Coorong region in search for fresh water. There's no physical evidence of this and there's no recorded evidence of this, but then why would there be? I mean, if they were doing their job properly, there wouldn't be any evidence. So we've got to sort of take this man at his word that we actually had German naval personnel set foot on Australian soil during the war.
And your presentation, you did it both on the Japanese subs and German subs, and many of our listeners would have knowledge of the Japanese submarines operating in Australian waters, and obviously the infamous attack in Sydney Harbour in 1942. But German subs was a new learning experience for me. Apart from U862, was there any other evidence of any other U-boat activity in Australian waters?
No, it seems to be, based on available information, we only have the one German U-boat. It doesn't seem entirely plausible that was just one, but maybe there was. We know that there were mine-laying boats and other things like the Penguin and those, which David Mitchell Hill Green discussed. So there was, but it was the only submarine we've been able to find a recording of.
Yeah. Do we know what happened to U862 after it had traversed Australian waters?
Yeah. Overall, it sunk about 42,000 tonnes over 7 ships that it sank. And when Germany surrendered, U862 was taken over by Japan in Singapore on the 5th of May and became the Japanese submarine I-502, which had a very short life. It was scuttled in February 1946.
I mean, your presentation was both on the German subs and the Japanese subs. So let's now switch the topic to the Japanese subs in Australian waters. And close to home for us who live in Victoria, tell us about I-25, please.
Well, okay, there were 13 known Japanese submarines in Australian waters during World War II. I won't list them all because that's fairly dull, but what I found amazing, particularly with I-25, and one of the reasons I focused on it was because of its Victorian connection, and we also had the marvellous Dr. Katie Gilchrist discussing the attack on Sydney Harbour. I-25 had a prelim reconnaissance involvement in that, and I didn't want to step on toes, so but I focused here on Victoria. I-25 was just over 105 metres long, so imagine that, and then say compare it to the Collins class submarines of today, which was 30 metres shorter. Collins is twice as wide and has places for the crew, but in this 100-metre submarine, the crew kind of were a secondary thought. In the Japanese submarine, they slept wherever there was somewhere to sleep. But what was most fascinating to me was how they did the reconnaissance. They had just in front of the conning tower of a submarine, and I'm going to use language that maybe not everybody knows, but it's great to look this stuff up. They had like a tube garage on the top deck in front of the conning tower, and inside that tube was 12 components that could be put together in 15 minutes to make a Yokosuka E-14Y float plane. To make it easier, the Americans referred to the float plane as Glenn. Bombers were female, and any other aircraft fighters and things were used male names, so we'll refer to it as the Glenn. Yeah. So they had a float plane that would then be steam propelled, still like they do now in aircraft carriers. There's a steam launch and push it off the bow of the submarine into the air, and then off it goes to fly its mission. And then when it returns, it lands, and they hoist it back onto the deck with a crane that's on deck, dismantle it in about 15 minutes, put it all back into the tube, and off they go. So they did that, one of those flights over Sydney, and then a couple of days later, another flight from one of the other reconnaissance submarines, and then the raid on Sydney. But the flight over Melbourne started particularly, well, I found it really interesting, and I have to thank Major General Mike O'Brien, who 20 years ago, almost, when I was a volunteer for the Army History Unit at Fort Queenscliff, he did a presentation on this story, and it stuck in my head. So I sort of, have been following it for years. But the Japanese submarines, these 13 submarines, didn't travel in a wolf pack or a particular flotilla. They had all sort of separate orders, although their orders were probably the same, which was just to cause a bit of havoc. But I-25 was at Pearl Harbor. In fact, most of the submarines off our coast were at Pearl Harbor at the time of that attack off the shore. They couldn't, for whatever reason, launch the plane on that day. Did a bit of patrolling off the US coast, spent a lot of time in the Pacific. So on February 25, 1942, the submarine itself surfaced about 10 miles north of Cape Wickham, which is off King Island in Bass Strait, about 240 k's south of Melbourne. And the pilot officer, a fellow by the name of Nobuo Fujita, and he had an observer with him, Petty Officer Shoju Okuda. They took off 2 hours before dawn with the plane, as I said, catapulted off the deck, which I imagine is probably a very scary process, because I know even today the modern fighter pilot basically braces for crash position and lets the plane be launched into the air, and once it's in the air, they then take control of it. So you can imagine, doing that on the sea at almost sea level, if you like. A bit different off a carrier, you've got a bit of distance. But anyway.
And also in darkness on this particular occasion. The launch was...
It's about 3 a.m. in the morning. So they cross Bass Strait heading for Cape Otway, where he banked northeast and followed to the coastline to Point Lonsdale. Like you saw the Point Lonsdale lighthouse, which is a good clue to enter Port Phillip Bay. I should say that the Japanese had particularly good maps, and so they knew Australia in terms of locations and detail fairly well. They had maps of streets and roads, and when you get into the details of Melbourne, they had a map made by our harbour master, effectively just translated into Japanese. It was brilliantly available. They struck a few banks of heavy cloud as they flew across the Bellarine Peninsula towards Port Arlington, with Geelong about 16 k's away. They broke out of the cloud directly over Laverton Air Base, which is a pretty good manoeuvre because that's what they were looking for. There were around about 12 Wirraways at Laverton, along with some Lockheed Hudsons and Avro Ansons. They recorded all of that in their, well, Akuta would have recorded all that. And some of the RWF personnel at Laverton reported sighting the Japanese aircraft. And some accounts claim 2 aircraft were scrambled to locate the float plane, but they didn't find it, which is a little incongruous if you consider that he was flying around for a couple more hours at float plane speed, which isn't the fastest. So he climbed back into the clouds, headed for Melbourne, passed over Altona, kept dropping in and out of the clouds every now and then to take observations. Melbourne was trialling wartime blackout conditions, so the observations would have been a little bit more challenging, but it was only trialling, it wasn't formalised, and there was no radar. In fact, radar was brought into the region about a month later.
Wow.
So he wasn't picked up on anything formal. Anti-aircraft gunners at Williamstown allegedly, again, spotted the aircraft, but they went through the whole process of rather making a decision on site. They went through a process of going up the chain of command to get a determination as to whether they could fire. And by the time that process fulfills, the plane is no longer within range. Again, that's not a criticism. That's just what happened on the day. No one was expecting it. Why would they think, oh, I've got to do this? Flew over St Kilda, Brighton, Sandringham on the way back. They had the canopy back on the aircraft, and some people claim they waved at these men, and the men in the plane waved back. But they recorded the 6 warships that were single file heading towards Port Melbourne Dock. A light cruiser and a few destroyers. They noted all of that. But in their record, what I found really interesting was Fujita noted the colours of roofs. He found there's clusters of red, green and yellow roofs, roof tiles. And he commented on the beauty of the countryside and flocks of sheep. So they were really providing a lot of detail in their little bit of reconnaissance. The flight was about 4 hours. It went for 600 kilometres or 370 miles. The I-25, when Fujita returned to it, he landed on the sea surface close to where he expected the submarine to be. Now, the reason I mention that is because, they were given instructions from somebody in the submarine that obviously the currents are going to do this, they're going to do that, where if we remain on the surface, we're going to move without, we're going to drift. So we have to take that into account. And the submarine most likely submerged for part of the flight because it would have been visible on the surface by daylight. So the I-25 had drifted 6 miles east of Cape Wickham, and Fujita and Akuta had to take in the weather conditions, the tidal drift and the time frame and the information they'd been given. And they did so effectively that they landed in sight of the recently surfaced submarine. So he's gone, oh, well, I'm going in this direction. Oh, there's the sub, and I'll land. That's testament to the ability of the aviators, I think.
Absolutely.
Yeah, just amazing. And the amount of information they recorded in that time. And as you know, it wasn't a lot talked about at the time, But as soon as it sort of became public knowledge that this plane had flown over, everyone claimed to have seen it. Sifting through, when I say in my presentation that allegedly or potentially these things happen, it's just because there's so many accounts of it, but I sort of couldn't verify the possibility that of all the people who claim to have seen the plane, that all of them did.
Is it fair to say, I mean, obviously the actual knowledge of the flight even today is not well known. Is it fair to say that when the aircraft, when it came over Laverton, Point Cook area and the anti-aircraft gunners, did they know at that stage that it was a Japanese plane, or was it a suspicion?
No, so that's the thing. One of the reasons there was no action against it is because people didn't realise it was what it was. I mean, when you see a Glenfloat plane of the era, and particularly Fujita's plane, it's clearly marked, and it's travelling relatively slow. I mean, if you look at even a modern jet in the air from a distance, it's just seems to be hovering. So I don't imagine that small planes flying over Melbourne was common, but you could easily conceive the idea that people would have looked at it, they would have heard it, and as I say, people sort of, the pilots waving out the window and stuff. That's all very conceivable because nobody would have thought anything of it. And he reports that those sort of things happened, but when it's gone over like Laverton, and they've said, oh, that's a Japanese plane, we should probably, if somebody at Laverton actually said we should do something about that, or there's no sense that information was passed around to other bases, because you would think that Williamstown would be ready for it. They'd be on alert that there's a Japanese plane going around. So even if people were able to identify it, the possibility of it was such that they would think, oh, well, maybe that's not, or maybe I'm misunderstanding this, because whilst it might be easy to believe that a chain of communication was somewhat flawed, it was probably not. It was probably very good. Just people were, my eyes deceive me. How can a Japanese plane be flying over us? Where on earth did it come from?
Yeah. And the I-25, it just didn't do an overflight of Sydney and Melbourne. But after Melbourne, she headed south. So tell us about that.
Went down the west coast of Tasmania and then popped up on the east coast and had a look at Hobart, which it also determined was a lower priority target. She noticed, what did they report here? 5 cargo ships at anchor, but no warships. They noted the glow of a foundry furnace and a big white concrete road. So they were getting quite an interesting detail. And I-25, when they picked up the float plane, they damaged the wingtip when putting it away. So they then head off from Tasmania towards New Zealand. And on the way, they surfaced to repair the plane before they make flights over Wellington and Auckland, and all by the end of March 1942. It's not just one flight. They just kept doing these things without molestation of any kind, really, because it's just audacious, I guess.
And after New Zealand, she keeps heading east even further. Yeah,
well, they do go home for a little bit and to Japan. And then they head off. Fujita has this idea that he's flying around with this plane, that he could drop bombs, with this plane. Wouldn't that be fantastic? And he has a meeting with a gentleman at the Kasamagura Naval Air School. He meets the Emperor's brother and another fella who was an ambassador to the United States, who says to him, who experienced quite a horrific bushfire there, similar, we know what they're like. A bushfire in Oregon that wiped out about 280,000 acres of Oregon forest. And they come up with this idea that what if they were to fly over the Oregon State Forest and drop incendiary bombs off the side of the plane and set fire to the forest? It will take up a massive amount of resources. People will die. It'll be, what a great idea. And Fujita sort of champions this and actually gets told, yeah, you're going to go and do it. So I-25 is probably its most famous mission, is 9th of September that year. It surfaces off the west of the Oregon-Californian border. The Glenn float plane is launched with about 154 kilos, 2 bombs, so they're fairly heavy. The 2 bombs were dropped, one on Wheeler Ridge on Mount Emily in Oregon, and to this day, the location of the other bomb is still unclear. That's how unsuccessful they were. The Wheeler Ridge bomb started a small fire that's about 16 kilometres due east of a town called Brookings, which the Forest Service employees were able to extinguish. And they found 27 kilos of that 72 kilo bomb. So they found that, but they've completely lost the other one.
Mm.
So the theory there is it's fallen into a large body of water.
Yeah.
And disappeared. But the I-25 came under a bit of attack after that, obviously. But they basically failed to do any real damage and do what they proposed to do, which was setting fire. But it does make the I-25 and Fujita particularly the only enemy bomber to bomb the contiguous United States.
Yeah. And he went on and he survived the war as well, didn't he?
Yeah, he did. His crewmate didn't, which was a bit sad. But Fujita went on. He survived the war and he opened a hardware store, which unfortunately went broke. And well, actually, I should say before the end of the war, he joined a kamikaze training school and was teaching the Divine Wind pilots to do their work, and was not short of his own mission when war ended. So he potentially would not have survived the war. But anyway, he survived all of that, and his story took a remarkable turn. In 1962, he was invited to Brookings in Oregon by the local JCs. He agreed to go after the Japanese government was assured he would not be tried as a war criminal.
Yeah.
Now, I should mention earlier on, when he enlisted in 1939, his very proud father gifted him the family's traditional sword. This was a 400-year-old piece of metal sword. It's traditional.
Yeah.
I can't say whether it was a samurai sword. If you know what a samurai sword is, you know that it's had to have killed somebody to be designated as such a thing, but it's the traditional family sword. So he arrived in Oregon carrying the 400-year-old sword, the cherished heirloom, because he was fearing hostility. Despite the guarantee from the government, he was prepared to commit his own ritual suicide or seppuku if met with rejection from the people of Brookings. But instead, he was warmly welcomed, so much so that the feeling to him from the city of warmth was that he gifted the sword to the city of Brookings. So he kind of gone from absolute fear to I have no fear, and to prove it, I will give you the source of my own demise should I remain in fear.
Incredible.
Yeah. And over the years, he deepened his bond with Brookings. He promised a trip for local high school students to visit Japan. And despite being his own bankruptcy, he made good on that promise, and he co-sponsored the visit of 3 female students from Brookings Harbour High School to Japan. And during the visit, they gifted him a US flag that had flown over the Capitol building. And he also received a dedicatory letter from an aide of President Reagan with admiration for your kindness and generosity. They're now on display at the training, the Casamigora Public Relations Centre, which is where he was training to be a kamikaze. He returned to Brookings in 90, 92 and 95. And in 1992, planted a tree at the bomb site as a gesture of peace. And in 95, he moved the sword from the Brookings City Hall into a display case at the new Brookings Library, which he helped to gain money to build. Just phenomenal. And he died in 97 at 85 from lung cancer. But he was made, a few days before his death, he was made a citizen of Brookings, honorary citizen. And his daughter buried some of his ashes at the bomb site. So it's a huge
what a story.
connection, yeah. And that was the bit that sort of appealed to me about him, was not just his ability as a pilot and an aviator, which was just amazing, but that whole story afterwards of how two people who can be at conflict with each other, two groups can come together. And it's not particularly Australian, but we are pretty good at this. If you consider after the First World War, a lot of the immigrants to Australia were Turkish and German. And after the Second World War, we had a lot more Japanese and German immigrants. The Vietnam War, we had Vietnamese immigrants coming into Australia, and we're bringing Iraqi and Afghanis and people in now. It seems that photo friend is natural.
Yeah, exactly, and that sort of that movement from war to a real sense of humanity is a great example of what you've spoken about Fujita and I-25. Now, what's next on the agenda for Military History and Heritage Victoria? What's coming up next?
We have an online speaker event coming up soon, Under the Same Moon, an Australian Battalion at War and Family at Home, with Peter Mitchell. This is a great book, by the way, if anybody can get hold of it. It's easy to get. It's available all over the place, but it is a really good read. And he's going to be talking about that book. And you can be anywhere to participate in this because it's done online via Zoom. You just come to the www.mwhv.org.au and sign up. But we've just announced the call for papers for our next conference, which is in October. And that is a call for papers for Fighting to the Finish, Australia in 1945, Strategy, Victory and Legacy. The idea there is that what we're looking for, or going to be talking about, is the fact that we're coming up to an anniversary at the end of, it's 80 years at the end of World War II. So let's talk about how we got to the finish and what led on from there. We've talked about the Cold War and other things before, and we'll talk again probably next year on the post-World War II conflicts. But this year we want to finish off the year with Fighting to the Finish. Professor David Horner will be our keynote, who was keynote at Menace, which is wonderful to have him doing that continuation. But we also have the author of the 1945 The Reckoning book coming out from the UK, Phil Craig.
Wow.
So if you've got some people who are listening who are interested in final campaigns in the Pacific, Australian strategic impact in the final year of the war, and occupation, homecoming and legacy, where we've got I don't know if it will happen, but we had a vice patron a few years ago, Dr. Jim Wood, who unfortunately passed away, who has written extensively on BCOF, the British Commonwealth Occupation Force in Japan. And so we're really keen if somebody wants to have a chat about that. From our conferences, it's not just, it's 25 minutes of a presentation, then it's conferencing, it's talking about these things, and in one day we can have 10 presentations because of the way we do it. So you get these really fantastic speakers in, and we all get to talk to each other and conference about them and ask questions and understand. And I think that's really important, and it's a big reason why we do it.
And they're great conferences. I mean, I've been to several now, and I think from a learning curve perspective, people may think they know a lot about Australian military history when they go into World War I or II or whatever the subject is, but you come away with such a great expanse of new knowledge from these conferences. It's important to note that you don't need to be a member of MHHV to attend the conferences, although if you do, it's a discount. So how can people join?
Well, the easiest way is to go to that website, mwhv.org.au, and there's a Join Us tab along the top, and you can click on that, and it will take you to a page that you can use a QR code to go and pay the membership fee. The membership fee is $50 for members, and that covers you for a calendar year, financial year. But what you get is discounts to a conference, to every talk. You also get a newsletter email that is unique to members. But if you just want to know about our events and what's coming up and opportunities, you can go to the bottom of any page on our website, and there is a subscribe to our free MHHV newsletter. We've also got a Facebook account and a Twitter account, and there's even a LinkedIn page for people who are into the socials. So with the Facebook thing, there's things that pop up there, sharing information and articles that we wouldn't normally put on our own website, because with social media, obviously you can share something, but you can't repost it on a website and publish it if you like. We have, by the way, several hundred articles on our website about history, so you can get in there and have a good Google. There is a media tab which includes such wonderful resources as this particular podcast. But also, if you go into the events tab, you can see previous MHHV conferences and previous speakers, and quite often they include either the written paper that was presented, so you can download the PDF or read it on the screen, and a video of the presentation. I'm working on the videos of Menace, but as I spoke for the first time, I have to admit that I've seen myself on video and I'm not pleased.
I'm sure it'll be great. So, look, again, in terms of your time today, we've learned a lot more about MHHV. People will leave this podcast today knowing that there was a German U-boat in Australian waters, World War II, and the fascinating story about the Japanese sub I-25. Jason, thank you so much for your time today, and I look forward to seeing you in person at the next conference for MHHV.
Thank you, David, and thank you for these podcasts. They're fantastic. People should listen to all of them.
That's the podcast for today. We're keen to hear your feedback by leaving a review on your podcast app. Your reviews helps new listeners find our podcast. If you have any special requests or suggestions for our podcast, please get in touch. You can help support this podcast via Patreon or Buy Me a Coffee. The links are on our website and Facebook page, and your support helps us with the production of this podcast. Do you have a relative who has served in the Australian military? Our family military history research packages sources records to better understand the service and experience of those who've served. You can find out more information on our website. Thanks for listening, and thanks for your service.